Although the Netflix MCU version of Daredevil has only been tentatively introduced into the mainstream MCU, it's not hard to see why the larger franchise was so willing to incorporate him into their narrative, as Netflix's Daredevil series is undoubtedly one of the best superhero stories adapted to the screen in the last 2 decades. And while plenty of aspects of Matt Murdock as a character were interesting, one of the most important and character-defining dynamics within the series was clearly the relationship between Matt and Elektra Natchios. The relationship between them is definitely an unhealthy dynamic. And frankly, it doesn't feel like their story was really all that it could have been. Given that Matt and Elektra are one of the biggest relationships in the Daredevil comics, it's not a great sign that Frank Castle's introduction and his interactions with Matt largely outshone his relationship with Elektra in Season 2. But with that said, the issues with their relationship are pretty readily apparent regardless, and there's a fundamental disconnect with their characterizations that illustrates why they were never, and could never be, a healthy relationship. But that fundamental disconnect is also what actually makes them interesting. Matt and Elektra's relationship was a very wild and electric one, and it's actually very narratively useful in the sense that it offered a glimpse into what propelled each character in their past, and showed viewers some very significant events that cemented the both of them into who they are. They're not a good match for each other, but they also know who they are because of each other. So, as an actual storytelling and character development device, their relationship was extremely vital, and the series really effectively used their constant conflict as a means of developing each character quickly and clearly. However, their relationship was one that seemed like it was always doomed to fail, and that's not just because of the whole Elektra trying to get Matt to commit murder thing. One of the most interesting and memorable things about Matt as a character, and as a superhero, is that he has a very firmly established moral code. And his relationship with Elektra explains a lot about how that moral code became such a pillar of his personality. But that was still who Matt always was, even before he realized that. Even before Elektra's behavior forced him to realize that. And while his behavior is definitely about what he believes is right, his behavior is also about establishing boundaries. Frank actually points this out really neatly, but Matt's refusal to cross certain lines is as much about what he believes is right as it is about simply grounding himself within a construct that gives him a sense of stability and relative normalcy. He doesn't want to kill people because he's not a killer, but he also doesn't want to kill people because he's afraid of what he'll do or who he might become if he allows himself to cross that line. It's as much about rationalizing his own behavior as it is about doing what he genuinely believes is good. Elektra, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. She does what she wants, what she feels, and what she thinks she needs to do, with hardly any regard for anything or anybody. She's incredibly and unapologetically self-serving. But even if she's trying to act in the interest of others, she does that by any means necessary. As she clearly demonstrates with Matt, she has no regard for his own rules and regulations, and is more than willing to do what he can't and won't in order to help him achieve his goals. She doesn't seem to understand or really care that Matt would still see her transgressions as crossing his personal lines. And for her, the ends always justify the means. Elektra is not just someone who doesn't want to play by the rules. She's someone whose self-image is defined by the fact that the rules simply do not apply to her. She doesn't want to be restricted by anything or anyone. And in her mind, this is what sets her apart from everybody else. This is what makes her superior. And interestingly, it's the complete and total opposite of how Matt sees himself. And it would be extremely easy to brush off Matt and Elektra's discordance as Matt being good and Elektra being bad. But that's a far too simple way of looking at it. Matt's moral superiority is a little dubious at best, as it often seems to be driven by following the metaphorical letter of his own laws, rather than the spirit that should be behind them. And on the other side of that coin, Elektra doesn't have some kind of philosophical commitment to bad behavior. It's just the easiest way for her to get what she wants. And therefore, that's what she does. That's actually what makes her one of the most interesting characters in the series. Because unlike nearly everyone else, morality really has no place in her mind, one way or the other. But the real problem between them, and the main reason why their relationship could never be healthy, again, speaking in relative terms, since by all normal standards, they're both nuts, is because they don't want each other to be themselves. They want each other to be each other. And again, while this puts them at direct odds with one another, it's also what makes them extremely fascinating as a duo. They both seem to genuinely believe that they found a kindred spirit through their relationship. But in reality, they're only seeing reflections of themselves in the way that they want to see them. They both demonstrate this perfectly towards each other at different points in the season as well. Elektra hands Roscoe over to Matt with the expectation that he'll react like she would react. That he'll do whatever he pleases with him before getting rid of him for good. Essentially, that he wants to be who Elektra is, but he's just waiting for someone else to give him permission to behave that way. But when Matt reacts differently, she doesn't accept what he's saying. She simply tries to push him into doing what she would do, because she wants them to be the same. And Matt does the same thing when Elektra comes back into his life. He tells her that she doesn't have to be this person, that she can be like him, while completely ignoring or flat out denying that this is just who she is and who she chooses to be, until it just about slaps him in the face. Neither of them can accept the other for who they are, and they're more concerned about forcing the other to become an adequate reflection of themselves than they are about actually dealing with the person in front of them. And frankly, if either of them truly realized that they couldn't change each other, I doubt that their interest in each other would be sustainable. But fascinatingly, the stark ways in which they contrast one another and attempt to force each other into boxes that neither one of them wants to occupy enables them to learn a great deal about themselves and about each other. Matt Murdock has barely been introduced to the larger MCU, but with the Netflix MCU TV shows being pulled from the streaming service, it seems like there's a very plausible possibility of the show being rebooted on Disney+. Disney-fying Daredevil doesn't sound like the best idea, but if they do decide to restart the series in any way, then it would be fantastic if they delved more deeply into Matt and Elektra's relationship, and both of them as individual characters. But what do you think? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.